All right, so again, welcome everybody to Building a Sturdy Foundation. Today, our objectives will be to understand the challenges we face as professionals, both as practitioners in information security and as business people and professionals. So to do that, we'll frame the impact. That's impact on us and our role, impact on the business, our colleagues, and other folks that touch areas of information security, and those that don't. We'll define, and what I hope to do is leave you with some good foundational steps and some ways to measure where you're strong, where you're weak, and kind of have a plan of attack for improving in areas where you're maybe struggling. And then all of that really is meant to drive better conversations around security. Because fundamentally our ability to be effective and to protect our mission, or accomplish our mission, and protect the data and lives that we are charged with is having the reach to do that. We have to be able to reach business folks, reach other practitioners in other areas. So obligatory disclaimer, these are my thoughts, words, views, yada yada. They're not anyone else's. So I want to say one thing before I move on. I'm going to be covering a lot of areas, a lot of program areas and topics. So if you have questions, if you wouldn't mind holding them for the end, just in case we run over on time, I'd be happy to discuss anything else at length that you'd like independently, or if folks want to have a few other questions, we can get together in a group. So who I am, my name is Stephen Legg. I'm at ZenMode on Twitter. I'm an InfoSec strategy consultant. I'm also a mentor, a dad. I've worn a lot of hats. I've been everything from an IT director, IT manager, senior security engineer, entrepreneur, and I'm also involved in a couple different community groups. I'm one of the founding members of BL04, which is a CTF organizing group that invests their time in training the community on different challenges to better assist them in accomplishing their mission. I'm a developer for the POSHSec project, and I'm the host of MySec Southfield. I also really like hardcore video games. I don't have a ton of time to play them anymore, but the Dark Souls series is one of my favorites, and I'll explain why that matters in just a second. So if you haven't played Dark Souls, or you're not a gamer, all you really need to know about Dark Souls is that it really forces your hand in terms of performing. It does this by posing to you challenges that are very, they're very confronting. For example, this meme is talking about the tutorial level. In Dark Souls, you start off, they teach you the controls with a couple little prompts, then you walk in a room and get crushed by a giant demon. That's kind of how our job feels sometimes, right? As information security practitioners. Very often, the story that we come into, and the story that I'm sure you're all familiar with and have heard in some form or another, business folks, executives, board members, maybe your IT manager or director, get together, they hear about some huge breach from the news, they're nervous, they don't know what to do. So to solve that problem, they say, let's get compliant, let's meet these standards, let's check all the boxes, do all the things. Let's go, executives. It's time to get serious. So they get together, numbers, 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 business, check boxes, do things, more secure. Is this working, Bob? Yes, it is. Make it so. Yay, we're all happy. Meanwhile, the rest of us, practitioners, engineers, maybe developers, we're all sitting there looking at these people going, hold on a second. The end is near here. You guys are taking us down a path that's not going to get us secure. Compliance does not equal security. And on it goes. So maybe your manager, could be a team lead, could be your director. It depends on the org, depends on your scenario. But in general, when confronted with this kind of a problem and these things are pushed down on them, they look at it and say, look, we just don't have the resources. We're too broke. And so they enable the best life hack ever for dealing with things you don't like, which is to shut your eyes. Don't pay attention. Everything's fine. We're doing great. We checked all the boxes. I got a blinky box that makes me feel really happy and good. Oh, something bad happened. Oh, well, that should do the trick. We have this blinky box, so we're fine. Which may leave us as practitioners feeling a little overwhelmed. You know, we're shoulder deep in triples, right? We don't know what to do with them. They're overflowing. We're distracted. Something comes up. Something else comes up. And on the back end, with our colleagues in our departments, we're having a conversation, you know, winter's coming. We must be prepared. And when it comes to the business folks, we're just way more hip on security than they are. We knew about winter before it was cool. But the reality is that winter's already here. It's not coming. And we have to get up to speed in a hurry. And for many of us, in enterprise and even below that, in mid-market companies, we don't necessarily hold ourselves to the standard we need to make that happen. And that's largely usually because we don't feel like we have the resources, the time, or the energy to do that. It feels like an unsolvable problem. And to you I say, you know nothing, Jon Snow. Because according to the Verizon DBIR, 60% of breaches or incidents are attributable to errors made by sysadmins, by practitioners, people that are wearing a hat at some point that have to make a decision about the way a system is deployed or how that project rolls out. So how do we solve that problem? What do we do about that? One place to start, and this is where I started, look at the SANS 20 critical security controls. Now, most of you have probably already seen these. This is nothing new. It's nothing incredible. But if you dive into the spirit of these controls and look at how they can really be rolled out, probably about 40% of them are things that I would consider a quick win. Something you can execute within a 3 to 4 month span that'll make a tremendous difference in the quality and posture of the security in your environment. For those of you that haven't seen these, you can go check out the critical security controls at this URL. The goal being, we as practitioners, and especially in a resource-constrained light, have to focus on the 20% of things that make 80% of the difference to us. Everybody's heard the Pareto principle. You know, in business lingo, they throw it around all the time. But it really has meaning for us. And we have to find and focus on those priorities that make the biggest impact. And practically speaking, what that translates into is baking in security from the start. You don't bake bread by putting half the ingredients in, cooking it for 30 minutes, then pulling it out and putting flour in, right? So why do we as IT and security professionals think that we can just overlay or retrofit security in projects and systems where it should have been there from the beginning? So let's get dangerous. This is all great. This is all conceptual. Let's talk about how we actually accomplish that, which gets down to our approach. So some of the things we need. These are not all information security programs. I realize that most of them are not. Most of them are not even things that information security professionals necessarily preside over or have authority over. But every one of these things has implications and direct impact on the overall posture and security of our environments and the businesses and systems that we manage for them. So what I did in performing this research was adapted the capability maturity model, the CMM, to assess the maturity of each of these program areas as I've defined them, figured out what those maturation steps look like, and then helped 3 organizations achieve that. The bottom line is, because all of that is very far-reaching, right? We could take that list and extrapolate it out to be enormous. There's a ton of actionable information there. What we have to do is keep calm, focus on the things we can do when we can do them to get that done. So let's talk about asset management. For those of you that don't know, asset management essentially is the way that, or the program that we use to stay aware of what we've got, where it's supposed to be, and who's supposed to be responsible for it, among other things. I mentioned in the slide there's financial, contractual, and inventory functions related to this, and the reason that's relevant is because we as security practitioners can enhance and drive that conversation about business value and not just security from these programs and from an asset management program. Capacity management is talking here about an organization's ability to be aware of workloads, how those workloads impact them, their productivity, what that really means in terms of both their security posture and their operational proficiency. From a security perspective, when we talk about capacity, we're concerned with denial of service, right? Whether it's internal or external, denial of service could happen from somebody, running too many jobs all at once, overloading the compute in their racks. They could just peg I/O on disks. They could do any number of things that create circumstances that are dangerous to the organization. And the same thing's true from the outside. So in terms of change management, a lot of folks think about change management strictly in terms of application development and the SDL process. But where change management is really important and where I see it fall down a lot, especially in mid-market companies, not so much in enterprise, but in mid-market companies, they don't think about it from an IT operations perspective or an information security perspective. And that's where it's very valuable, because if you're weighing the risks of the changes you're making and thinking about them before you make them, and documenting and verifying that they had the effect that you wanted, you head off a lot of issues. You prevent yourself from creating holes in your posture that would not otherwise exist. Communications management here I've defined as risks related to improper use of communication platforms. That could be anything from emailing plain text passwords to making sure that your vendor connections are set up in a way that gives them least privilege and causes the least amount of risk to your environment. Configuration management is talking about the program area that directly presides over that, maintaining that pristine system state, right? Having all of our assets functioning the way that we intend them to, with the use cases we intend them to, and without allowing things from outside sources to change that. Some of the ways we do that are, application whitelisting and blacklisting, policies, local security policies, things like that. And this helps us prevent or minimize risks related to changes to that system state. Data management here, as I've defined it, is really talking about what we're doing with data when it's at rest and in storage and how it's used. And a big part of that is data classification. A lot of companies don't go through the process of understanding what data they've got and how it should be used and where it should be used and by whom. Being aware of those things assists us in making more strategic decisions on preventing theft and misuse of that data by authorized or unauthorized parties. Event management, really when we're talking about this, as this differs from communication management, we're talking about like both the forensic and logging side of a house and how we interpret that, whether that's through a SIM, some other kind of log interpreter, and everything in between those. It's the settings that we're configuring on those endpoints and assets. It's the structure of the monitoring and how we're creating those priorities in terms of responding to alerts and whatnot. And that has far-reaching implications. That's our set of eyes in the environment. Identity and access management, as I've defined it here, is really just all about making sure everyone that's using the system is who they say they are, and they're doing with the system what they should be doing. A well-managed IAM program will tightly control that and give you alerts where exceptions are happening. Incident management really is our plan of attack for when a security incident happens. Whether that's, a breach, say a malware outbreak, could be anything, could be, a physical breach of the building. But how we manage that incident and what we do with the data, how we maintain the state of the data, how we know which authorities to contact and what to communicate to them. All of those things are critical when you're building an incident management program. Infrastructure management, as I've defined it here, really is coming at this from the perspective of how the architecture of your systems fit together to create a technical set of controls. For example, a lot of, especially mid-market companies, but in general, big companies too, do not air gap. They don't use VLANs and access lists to separate network segments. That's one example of how infrastructure management may be implemented, or an effective infrastructure management program. IT continuity management, we're talking about our business continuity planning and disaster recovery. But also, from a security perspective, how we're implementing controls to protect those environments, just like we would production environments. Because when we think about it, those environments, even if that data is a month old or a week old, why would an attacker care? Why would a criminal care if that data is a little bit older? They don't. If I'm an attacker on the network and I'm just looking for a soft spot, and I notice that the DR stack has no controls or few controls when I poke around, I'm going to go there and grab that data. Lifecycle management, as I mentioned, as this relates to change management, very often we think of this in concert with SDL. SDL is a huge part of this, obviously. But also, lifecycle management is really meant for us as security practitioners and IT folks and business people to make sure that we're approaching the ongoing management and integration of new assets and retiring of old assets in a way that we're planning for the capacity we need, not only to operate, but to operate securely. Because as we know, as security practitioners, there is a cost, an operational cost to every piece of security software, every appliance, all of those things need to be considered. And what that does is assist us in preventing, on the SDL side, misuse of outdated code or unreviewed code. On the IT operations side, prevents us from misusing or leaving assets in production that don't need to be, and thus reduces our risk a little bit. So the last area we'll talk about is vulnerability management. Most of you are probably familiar with vulnerability management, but I'll go over it quickly. Really what this does is allows us to get an inventory, depending on the tool we use, an inventory of vulnerabilities that exist in both our code and segments of code from an application development perspective. From a IT operations or more IT-focused perspective, we're talking about the vulnerabilities that exist as they relate to things like the patch state of those assets, as they relate to the architecture, the construction of those assets. And so kind of as we talk about these, you notice a lot of my language is pointing back at different other programs. That's because all of these in general together are the things that compose our overall posture. And there are security implications in each of these that we'll talk about in our next section, which is the case studies that I've done. So let's talk a little bit about businesses that were kind enough to run through this with me. So business number one is a manufacturing business. They have one location. That location includes an office and a manufacturing floor. They have about 120 users. A little over 30 of those users, I think it was just under 40, are office users. The rest are manufacturing staff. Now, when I say has in place here, this is an overall look at the state of these programs as it pertains to their business. When I say that they have something in place or they're working on something, that doesn't necessarily mean they have a perfect program in place, right? That means that they have that area on their radar. Maybe something happened down the road that caused that to be a priority for them. And the same is true for areas where they're working on things. They may not have something in place necessarily, but they're working on putting it in place. This company also used Office 365 and a few other cloud-based applications with federated services, and they outsourced several of their functions. So business number two is a multi-site finance organization. They're a bank. They have about 280 users. All of those users are either internal office staff or customer-facing office staff, but they're tellers, they're people on the phone, they're interfacing and providing information to those users. So they really, because of their priorities as a financial institution, compliance was very big on their map. They cared a lot about, especially PCI, but not just PCI, because they were also a creditor. They cared a lot about PCI. They really were focusing on getting those controls in place to minimize their risk of fines and fees. Business number three is a healthcare system. They're multi-site. They've got over 400 users, more than half of which were medical practitioners. So those are folks that are actively using EMR systems. They're actively engaging in patient care in other ways. And they, again, being that they're in a highly regulated industry, were very concerned with their compliance, especially as it pertained to HIPAA and high tech. That's not an uncommon conversation, as any of you that work in the medical field know. So most of their focus and all of their internal staff's energy went into ensuring that they're checking all those boxes, but not necessarily that they were kind of capturing the spirit of those controls and recommendations made by the compliance requirements. So let's talk about constraints. I think we could all agree that every business, every team really struggles with mostly the same things, regardless of size. We're all constrained by budget. We always, regardless of how big the pie is, have to decide how it's chopped up, where we put it, what we're going to invest it in. And very often we have to make a choice between doing, a few things and then not doing others. And in my experience, most organizations, anytime you're talking about more than 5 or 10% of that budget for a particular department or organization, you're getting perhaps board members involved, but at a minimum management. So you need to be able to speak to the value of these changes and other things that you have going on. Let's talk for a moment about people. We're all people in the world, right? We're working towards this end goal of being more secure, protecting our assets, making these things happen. We as practitioners have to make sure that we're caring for our families. We're doing things that we need to do outside of our work environment, which leads me into experience. not everybody, and I'm sure you guys all feel this way, we don't always have the time to catch up on everything we want to. You know, we'd all love to spend hours and hours poring over, you know, the latest threat intelligence, new tools, practicing using those tools, doing testing. But we just frankly don't always have the time to gain that experience. And not having the experience makes using those tools extremely difficult when we're talking about making the most of them or having an impact with them. And all of that rolls together to talk about how we deal with the fact that we are constrained. And the simple answer, although it's not one that's simple in implementation, it's just simple in explaining, is to use what you have. You know, take advantage of those moments, the points in time when you can focus on the things that will make a big impact. So let's talk about how we've done that. We're very deep in concept right now, and I want to get into how we translate that into real world. So specifically, let's start with assets, capacity management, and change management. So for business number one, again, this is a manufacturing company. We're going to look at their asset management program. To recap, asset management is how we know where all the things are, who should have them and who's responsible for them, what rev level they have, all those kind of things. So where I was able to help this company, they didn't have any kind of automated way of collecting that data. And I'm sure many of you feel this way about, you know, different aspects of your asset management program. How many times have you been handed an Excel spreadsheet that's like 5, 6, who knows how many years old? It hasn't been updated. It's not, you know, nothing is where it says it is. It maybe has some correct data, but it's not really helping you. So the way we drove this out of them, or for them, or the way I drove this for them, was that we used their existing remote monitoring and management. This is an IT operations tool, remote monitoring and management platform to collect this data, in addition to using some simple PowerShell queries. The platform they had was LabTech. There are others like this out there. There's open source monitoring and management platforms. But what we did, and what LabTech does, using WMI and other technologies underlying, is collect that data and generate reports pretty easily with some simple queries. So let's talk about capacity management. Business number 3, again, was that healthcare organization, where they were running into issues. Specifically was in the way that their EMR and some of their service delivery appliances were concerned. Many of, especially on the service delivery side, those appliances were, the computer systems that were associated with them were designed for a much lighter workload than what they were being put through. You know, it was a situation where they had attached multiple machines to, you know, single controlling machines. And so those controlling machines, as they were, you know, uploading data, scanning x-rays, moving those files around, they'd chug. To the point where if the staff proceeded in a way that you can conceivably proceed, right? They're just seeing patients, they're not thinking at all about the computer systems. They would actually create service outages because of that circumstance. They'd go to do their work and crash those systems. On the EMR side, because they had an in-house homebrew electronic medical record system, that system was designed in a way that caused the I/O on their storage to spike every time certain reports were ran. And so they were essentially DOSing themselves every time more than one person ran any of these series of reports. And so to review again, just quickly, capacity management is really all about benchmarking those things understanding the performance and the metrics and what you can expect to see, and using that baseline to get you through and plan for changes in your environment and the normal use cases that you've got. I think we might have a power issue. I'm not sure if that's plugged in or not. Anyway, if we lose it, I'll just keep talking. So what we did here is we rated the systems depending on their volatility, how much they spiked and how they spiked. Used weekly and monthly reports on that usage and those benchmarks to adjust the resources and plan budget and future life cycle refreshes around that. The specific constraint there for these guys is that they couldn't just replace those controller systems. The software that ran their, for example, their X-ray machines was proprietary and specifically built on a very dated architecture. So they had to have these older machines. So by doing this and planning it that way, we were able to make a business case to refresh a lot of that stuff. And we did that using, on the Windows side, Performance Monitor and driving reports out of that. But in general, and on both Windows and Linux systems, we leveraged Nagios to do that and generate some of those reports. And I put Zabbix here, even though we didn't use it in this particular use case, because Zabbix is a very good platform built on top of Nagios, and it also provides some better kind of enterprise-ready reports and reporting functions. If you want to take a look, that's the URL. Check Zabbix out. It's very good. So moving up back to Business One, this is, again, the manufacturing company. Their change management program. We formed a change control board of their appropriate management and IT staff. We leveraged their existing ticketing system on the application development side, using the, the OWASP cheat sheet, the SDL cheat sheet, and implemented using their service ticketing system, which was ConnectWise, a status approval loop for that change control board for IT operations changes. And then connected the compliance team with both of those systems for validation and verification. Again, they use Service Manager on the AppDev side, ConnectWise on the Ops side. If you want to check out the OWASP Secure SDLC cheat sheet, that's the URL. It's very good if you're a developer or you work with developers. So let's talk about communication, configuration, and data. Business number 2, which again was the bank, their communications management system. We worked with their outsourced IT vendor to VLAN off and segment their network, which enabled their system resources to provide additional visibility when activities that they didn't want were going on, right? So someone does a port scan or some other kind of reconnaissance on the inside of the network, they're hitting all those ACLs and generating noise. They're rattling the cages. And then at the firewall level and from their proxy server, we restricted all but those approved types of communication in and out. And exfiltration is an area where a lot of people don't think restrictions are important, but it is. Because if somebody can get in but they can't get their payload out, you've effectively slowed them down enough to force them to rethink their strategy. And something that I didn't know going into this, but I learned through this engagement, was that Office 365 actually has encrypted email functionality built into it. So when they were sending patient information or other things that they needed to, I'm sorry, that's the bank. When they were sending documents with PII in it, they didn't have to worry so much because they could do it in a secure fashion. So configuration management for business number 1. Again, configuration management is our maintenance of that pristine state. We leveraged heavily their Windows environment and using Active Directory to keep the configuration management standards implemented on all those systems. We implemented WSUS to help them manage patching. At that point, they had turned patching off, and enabled the software restriction policy to perform that application whitelisting. So for business number 3, in terms of data management, we worked with their development staff to identify, classify, and restrict access to data based on the use case of that data. In this case, they had several databases that were kind of interconnected and passed a lot of information between each other, but it didn't need to be architected that way. And with some pretty quick tweaks, they were able to get a lot more functionality and security out of their development process and their data at rest. So one way that I did that, or one recommendation I made to them was to take a look at the OpenSAM project, which if you're not familiar with it and you're a developer, you should take a look. OpenSAM is actually the OWASP secure SDL framework. It overlays over Agile or Waterfall. So I'm kind of rushing through this because my battery might run out, so I don't want to lose my slides. So from an event IT continuity and vulnerability management standpoint, business number 2 struggled with event management, which again is our both forensic and ongoing logging of activity on the network, right, and on our assets. So what I did was adjusted the domain event log settings. That's on endpoints driven through policy to maximize the effectiveness of their in-house SIM. And then we set up quarterly exercises to test specific abuse cases and be certain the SIM was actually catching that activity. So for those of you that run a SIM, if you haven't heard of Ultimate Windows Security and you work in a Windows environment, take a look at it. It's very good. It speaks very well to a lot of the settings that will assist you in tuning the amount of noise down and keeping everything that comes into your SIM, or with the long-term goal of keeping everything coming into your SIM actionable and meaningful. From an IT continuity management standpoint, business number 3, the healthcare org, wasn't testing any of their DR or data recovery points throughout the year. They had no idea if their systems would actually work or not. So what I recommended was a recurring program to annually test that, and then on a quarterly basis test smaller instances or use cases of their data recovery process. So going back to business number 2, talking about vulnerability management. Again, this is the bank. I subscribed them to FS-ISAC and some other threat intelligence sources to get them some actionable information that they could use to tune their security systems and approach, and also use that to drive internal testing. And then got their InfoSec, their security folks, talking to their IT operations group about what they were finding and being driven out of that using OpenVAS. They, at that point, did not have the budget to add a paid vulnerability management platform, so they used OpenVAS as a starting point. If you want to check it out, OpenVAS is at this URL. I'm going to kind of blow through these next couple because I don't know when it's going to cut out on me. Oh, it just did. All right. So from an infrastructure management perspective, again, we're talking about the controls that we put in place to secure those environments. For these case studies, across all of them, one of the big tools that I used and that I found very helpful was the CIS benchmarks. I had the URL on my slides, which I just lost. But the CIS benchmarks give you a pretty good baseline understanding of where your local security settings need to be for many different types of systems. Everything from Windows, Linux, network appliances, all kinds of stuff, and they're adding more and more all the time. So that was one. Another point to look at from that perspective is in the life cycle management side of things. What a lot of folks don't do, and I think I mentioned this in terms of asset management, but what a lot of organizations don't do is take the information that's available to them, driven out of their asset management program, and use that to drive their life cycle management conversations. So where does that leave us from an incident management perspective? In incident management, if you have not built an IM program, you don't have an IR, incident response plan, SANS actually has some really great resources. And I apologize, I had links, but I don't have my slides now. So if you Google Incident Response 101, if you Google SANS Incident Response Forms, if you Google SANS Incident Response Playbook, those are all great documents that contain a lot of foundational, especially from a policy standpoint, foundational steps that you can take to start building and maturing your incident management program. So I'm going to wrap up by talking about and touching back on some of the points we covered earlier. So we know winter's here. We know threats are out there today. They're affecting us in ways we realize and don't. We as security practitioners have to up our game. We have to start having better conversations with folks, business folks, IT folks, developers, everyone, to create more visibility and focus on distinguishing good security practices. Because really, if we think about what good security practices are in essence, good security practices are really just good and responsible IT operations practices or application development practices. And good IT operations and application development practices really, if you boil them down, are just good business practices, right? They help us operate efficiently, cleanly, and securely to achieve our organization's end goal. But what we manage by doing that, if we do that effectively, is the risk that it poses, that those systems pose to all the lives that are touched by what we do and by what those systems do. Because ultimately, we as security practitioners are the only defense those people have. So once again, my name is Stephen Legg. I'm at ZenMode on Twitter. This has been Building a Sturdy Foundation. Thank you very much.